Hello, and welcome to Raised by Horror. Raised by Horror is a podcast for grown-up latchkey kids of all genders and orientations whose proxy parents were horror films and books. We're your hosts, Violet Blue and Richard Cagri, with showrunner Scotland Simmons. Check out raisedbyhorror.com for more info.
Hello,
Hi.
welcome to the show. Welcome to Raised by Horror. We are your hosts. I'm Violet Blue. That's Richard
And I'm
Cadry.
Richard Cagri.
We have our showrunner, Scotland Simons.
Hi.
And hello. And we're here to talk about horror books, horror films, and just the general concept of horror, why it inspires us, why it excites us, why it teaches us things, why it scares us, and why it makes us want to talk about it. So, and I want to put forward too that we are going to talk about a lot of films and books and TV from an all gender, all orientation perspective. We have some pretty good boundaries about horror for ourselves. For instance, we don't like films that have animal harm in them, so you won't find us talking about that very much, if at all. And spoiler alert, we are going to talk about a lot of spoilers. So if you don't want spoilers for any of the films that we're talking about, you're definitely going to want to fast forward or maybe skip parts of the show. And if you want to see what films we're talking about, you can visit our website, raisedbyhorror.com, and you'll find a post for each one of the shows that has a list of the films that we talk about. So you can protect yourself from spoilers that way. So our show today, our first show, is about films that scared the shit out of us as kids. And I think everybody has that memory, these memories, right, of these films that we saw when we were young or maybe too young to be seeing these films. And they just left us with scenes in our heads or feelings or vibes. And I don't know, Richard and I were both just really drawn to kind of like explore that topic.
Mm-hmm.
I did my damnedest to not watch anything scary because I'm just for full explanation, like I am not a horror movie aficionado, nor am I very good at watching horror films. So yeah, there's that. So everything I find terrifying. Just to add to that topic.
So everything here is going to be brand new to you. You have no idea who
Well,
we're
some
going to be
of
talking
it.
about. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of things that people consider horror movies or are classified as horror movies, and I never really considered them a horror movie. Like
Mm-hmm.
uh Ash versus the Evil Dead, I don't really consider a horror movie. That's a comedy to me.
Yeah.
It's very much a comedy.
Yep.
Yeah. And I like vampire stuff, and I don't really consider that horror, I guess. It's confusing. Actually, what is
Yeah.
horror? What do you qualify as horror? Like,
Richard has to answer that one.
Well, that's something I've been thinking about for a while now. And the difference between, I think it's the difference between frightening and fascinating. I think for me, what I've come to is that horror is essentially an experience of awe, however you define awe. An awe that kind of shakes you in some primal way that can cause a fight or flight reaction. It could be a monster that you can't explain, or something as unearthly and beautiful as the Cenobites in Hellraiser. And in the case of something that far out of your experience, I also think I think there's a kind of religious awe that can be part of horror, that primal fear we were taught as children, where there was something so overwhelming. It's sort of Jesus's cosmic horror kind of a thing. So I think for me, there's almost this, for how I was raised, there is almost a weird religious component to horror for me, even if I don't put it in the horror I write. But I think one of the things that always amused me about Hellraiser in particular is Cenobite is in fact a word for priests in a close religious order.
Oh.
So the idea of, which is perfect for Clive Barker, sex, religion, awe, all that stuff. So for me, it what I really love about horror is when it takes me someplace that makes me feel like I'm standing at the edge of the abyss.
I
I
like that.
agree. Yeah.
Okay, for the uninitiated then, what could you describe what a Cenobite is for those who may not know, so we can paint this like vivid picture of horror?
Well, the classic Cenobite is Pinhead from Hellraiser, and that's the easiest image you can find. If you Google that, even though Google is kind of useless these days, if you Google Pinhead Hellraiser, you will see an amazing image. And if you just Google Hellraiser Cenobite, you'll see some astonishing images, all of which came out of Clive Barker's brain, because he did paintings of all these creatures. He's a very good painter too. In fact, I have a tattoo of one of his paintings.
Oh, cool.
I didn't know he
And
was a painter.
he's a very good painter and is rep by a big gallery in LA.
Oh wow, that's
Wow.
super cool.
Yeah.
Huh.
And so yeah, I think the Cenobites are these creatures that exist beyond time and space, and walk that borderline between pleasure and pain. And again, in a way that kind of brings up awe, because it's not just, obviously there's SM component to it, but the way they take it so far into an otherworldly version of that, that it's, again, it's SM combined with cosmic horror. It's SM fucking stars, or being fucked by stars.
Okay,
Yeah.
I can kind of see the attraction.
But they're also, I mean, it's horror, so they're also really scary. And
Yes.
that's an important component to horror for me, is the awe that you describe. I'm, as an atheist, I don't get the religious context as much, though I
Mm-hmm.
appreciate the ritual and I appreciate the trappings of traditions, with religious things and the the strange mythologies and stories and things like that that come with it. But it's the terrifying aspect of it, right? Like where it's like, where horror for me in that context is like it pokes that part of your brain that you didn't know was there to be poked, in a way where it's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, so initially seeing Hellraiser when I was younger, it didn't scare me, but it was horror for me, because it was, not just because it was gory or grisly or anything like that, which it certainly is, but it's more along the lines of, it's, the puzzle box that opens, and you can open it by accident sometimes, but it also is a component of you that opens the box that you can't
Mm-hmm.
control. And it's this place that's always been waiting for you, that you didn't know was lurking, waiting for you. And the box opens this tear between the worlds, and you have no choice. You go in there and then you suffer in creative ways, endless ways. And it's something you always wanted, but at the same time, it's something that you can't escape. And
Mm-hmm.
it's, like all of those things, it was sort of like, as a concept, that's terrifying. Like that's really scary. And that was a concept I hadn't thought of before. And so for me, like the aspect of awe was like, wow, here's this thing I never thought of, and that's one of the things I love about really good horror films and horror books, particularly, is being shown something that I've never seen before, or being introduced
Yes.
to an idea that I've never been introduced before, or that sense of discovery when you're surprised about the way something turns out.
Mm-hmm.
And the extra thrill ride that if it's scary,
Yeah.
like roller coaster sort of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Were you scared of monsters as a kid? Because I was not. I grew up with monsters, and they were my friends. Creature from the Black Lagoon was a really early one for me, and I loved the look of the creature. And
Yeah.
I think after that, just monsters became just part of my world, and they just didn't scare me anymore.
Yeah, same. I was never like monsters didn't do it for me. It was never werewolves or
Mhm.
Frankenstein's monster or any of that stuff. And and definitely not any of I wasn't afraid by any of the religious monsters either. So for
Mhm.
instance, The Exorcist I thought was hilarious.
Yeah.
I was just like, ah ha ha, that there's pea soup. It's really funny, and she's just like, ah, fuck me, Jesus. And I'm like, ah ha ha ha, oh my God, that's hilarious. And some of my friends are like, oh, that's horrifying. And I'm like, that didn't work for me.
Yeah.
So those, like, the typical monsters with one exception that I'll definitely bring up when let's get into these films, because there's one exception
Okay.
to what I'm
I
saying.
I,
But
I have
the
one
typical
too.
monsters didn't really do it for me. It was other things that really, really scared me. Um, yeah.
I know from my perspective, no, I loved monsters and made up creatures when I was a kid. Like they also like were my friends in my head. I
Exactly.
unfortunately went to Catholic school, and so religious things like really tortured my brain until I exited that whole situation to a place now where I don't believe in anything, which is great. Um, but yeah, no, honestly, the thing I found the most horrifying growing up was people. Like
Yeah.
the monsters are
Oh
great.
yeah.
I just hate people. They're the perpetrators of all the horribleness. Like, and at least from my
Mhm.
perspective. So I
It
don't
was
Well,
know.
pretty
there's that
clear to
whole
me.
horror that's not monsters. It's for me, what scares me more than monsters is that kind of human-based horror. Texas
Mm-hmm.
Chainsaw Massacre,
Yeah, I hate it.
Wolf
Mm-hmm.
Creek, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Yeah.
harder stuff. I can watch monsters dismember people left and right, and it doesn't bother me at all. But Leatherface and people like that. That's what I find scary in a primal way.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I love a good creature and I love a good monster, especially new ones that aren't traditional ones. But
Hmm.
growing up, it was really clear to me, watching, creature features and the afternoon frights on TV and stuff like that. It was just really obvious to me that monsters were actually just misunderstood people. Like,
Hmm.
I totally got that.
They're just my
Unless they
friends.
were insects. Unless they were insects.
Okay, talk
That's
about
and we're
it.
going to get into that later.
Let's go. Let's do it.
You want to go?
Yeah, go
Yep.
for it.
All right. I am going to look at notes along the way here because some of these because I want to get right on some of this. But talking about insects, 1955's Tarantula. It comes out of those 1950s nuclear post-atomic bomb, post-Nagasaki, post-Hiroshima nuclear fears, in which you had a run of giant animal and insects movie. I saw this as a kid on TV, and I don't know if it gave me arachnophobia or if it just triggered the arachnophobia that I have to this day. It starred John Agar, who was sort of the king of the B movies, and apparently incredibly an annoying human because he really thought he was because he was king of the B movies. He really thought he was a major movie star and drove everyone mad. And another thing I like about the movie is it also stars Leo G. Carroll as a mad scientist. And again, as a child growing up in New York, when I was young, New York had a lot of TV stations, and they showed the whole history of television and movies. So I could watch a current TV show, and then the next thing on is Groucho Marx's TV quiz show from the 50s. So all of these things existed in one time continuum for me. So Leo G. Carroll, the crazy scientist, was also Topper in a comedy TV series from the 50s about a very stuffy man is haunted by two charming ghosts. And so I only knew Leo G. Carroll as a comedy guy. And then suddenly
Oh,
he's a mad scientist making giant insects. And that was very hard for my brain to wrap around. And that's the wonderful part about Tarantula is it makes no sense on any level because you have Leo G. Carroll, the scientist. He says in the population of the world is expanding, and they're like by 1980, by the year 2000, there will not be enough food for people. So I have a formula where I am going to make everything giant. So as you look around his lab, you see a giant rat, which is like, all right, a giant rat, because all scientists use rats. Okay, fine. Next to that is a giant guinea pig.
Yes.
And as a child, it's puzzling, but then you grow up and learning, okay, a lot of people eat guinea pigs in the world. And then right next to that is a tarantula the size of a man. And that is not addressed at all. No one at any point asks, why did you make a giant spider? That isn't addressed.
They're not delicious.
They're not delicious. And so, of course, there's a fire at the lab. The tarantula is gets loose and runs around the desert doing giant spider things. And what's shocking is the movie isn't that badly made. It's actually fairly well made for the kind of a really cheap B movie from the 50s. And one of my favorite moments is that we have the giant spider. He runs off into the desert. And then we don't see him again for like a good 25 minutes. And the giant spider doesn't show up again in this really good, I don't know if it's a Freudian moment or if if the scriptwriter knew what he was doing, but like right when the male and female lead are kind of getting romantic, the giant spider that's when the spider causes a little avalanche and kind of rolls up over the hill.
Ugh.
Right. And, it's mostly a movie about fear and for the characters trying to wrap their brains around not just a giant insect, but again, the nuclear implications of all this. And because when they try to kill it, they try to blow it up with, they shoot it, obviously, because they're idiots in the 50s. And this giant building-sized spider is not going to notice their stupid little bullets. But then they try to blow it up with dynamite. That doesn't work. So then they call into the Air Force, and the Air Force sends in jet fighters with missiles. And then the missiles don't work. Nothing works until suddenly someone shows up with napalm.
Oh.
And all the cultural and political stuff that goes along with napalm and napalm finally is the hero of the movie.
Wow.
Napalm finally kills it. But if you're a little kid afraid of spiders, a giant spider is scary. A giant burning spider is really horrifying.
Is that the part that really scared you?
It was. I mean, the giant spider was terrifying, but then it was engulfed in flames, and then just these burning legs sticking out of this ball of flames.
Creepy.
Just tore me up.
Wow. I mean, part of me is like, why didn't they just make a big cat?
I feel bad for the big spider.
Yeah. It was such wonderful script writing. It was like, again, yeah, we're gonna make stuff for the world to eat. I don't know. Let's and he wasn't trying to grow vegetables. I mean, there was the Deadly Mantis, which has the same premise, where they're trying to grow giant vegetables, and then some locusts get in there, and then they turn. No, I'm sorry, that's not the mantis. I'm sorry. Beginning of the End. Sorry, that's the grasshopper movie. But it's the same premise. We're going to make giant stuff with nuclear isotopes, and then all the insects are going to grow giant. But at least that movie was about food. Tarantula is just, I'm going to make something we can have for a sandwich and a giant insect, because that's logical.
For lulz, I guess.
Right. Science lulz.
Wow. Was that the first, do you think that was like one of the first films that scared you as a kid?
It's the first one I remember. It's not the first one ever, but it's the first monster that really scared me. Because like I said, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Frankenstein, all that stuff never got to me. But that spider, I have a real primal thing about spiders. The way they move, the way they have too many damn eyes.
Yeah.
Basically anything to do with spiders. Oh, and the other great part about Tarantula to scare you as a kid is there are close-ups of the giant spider coming to eat you. And then they
Oh.
have reversals. They have spider cam. So
Oh,
we look down from the spider's point of view as it goes down to gnaw on people.
wow. Okay.
So
That's
it's just perfect movie if you're scared of insects.
right. It's pretty gross. So,
And we know
okay,
it's not an
so
insect, it's an arachnophobe. It's an arachnid, so don't yell at me for that.
right.
Don't put something in the comments section. I know it's an arachnid.
Yeah, don't actually us, man. Um, so you've got me thinking of mine because like Tarantula is black and white, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and so for me, the first one I can remember, and it's just the most ridiculous film, but I can still see it in my head, like the scenes that terrified me as a child. And that's the thing about films that scare you as a kid, like that there's always like a moment that sticks with you,
Mm-hmm.
like that you can just recall. And I mean, and going back over and thinking about this and talking about it has like, I'm definitely, learned some things about myself, but also I'm just like, wow, it's really interesting that that's what really tripped that switch for me. And for me, it was, I can't remember, I was at someone else's house. I was really young. And it was afternoon TV, and there was a black and white movie on, and it was Invasion of the Saucermen, which
Mm-hmm.
is from 1957. And it is the dumbest movie. Like, it is just so ridiculous. It's like, it literally takes place in a place called Hicksville. Like, it's an American, it's Hicksville. Aliens come down in a saucer and they're going to attack the town for reasons, alien reasons, I guess. Yes. And
Those are those are your little guys.
yeah. And so they come down, and there's like, lovers at Lovers Lane, and there's like a really dumb, eloping backstory going on with that. And then there are two drunks, two like drifter grifter drunks, that are like, you know, they're in a nearby area to the Lovers Lane. And the couple that's the main protagonist, kind of like, they go, they decide to leave, and as they're driving away in their car, they bump over something, and it's an alien, and they get
Mm-hmm.
out and they're like, it's an alien, we should run and tell the cops. And the two drifter grifter dudes come over, and they're like, ooh, an alien, we can make some money off this, like, let's sell this alien. And I think one of the guys leaves, and Joe stays. And Joe, interestingly enough, played by Frank Gorshin, who then went on to be the Riddler.
Oh,
It's like one
yes.
of his earliest roles, and he looks like he's 12 years old. And still just super cute. I love him so much. And you can actually see some of the early iterations of like his physicality as the Riddler, in his acting, being drunk and stuff like that. But anyway, long story short, Joe stays with the alien. Other aliens show up, and they're pissed because you killed our dude. So they kill Joe, and they swap Joe's body for the alien. And the way they kill is basically like needles come out of their fingertips,
Ooh.
and they inject their victims. And according to the story, they inject them with alcohol, which is just, don't ask me why they chose that. But anyway, so that's creepy. And then of course the kids come back and with the cops, and they're like, nah, you killed a person, there's no alien, you kids are crazy. And the kids are like, you don't believe this because we're kids. And that's kind of like one of the running themes then, is basically like gaslighting these two kids, right? Because no one believes kids. In the meantime, the aliens begin their assault or whatever, and they're unkillable, of course. But the thing that really got me was, so, looking at the aliens now, and I can see like that, it makes total sense that like, other films and TV shows since then have taken their inspiration basically from the way that these characters look. But as a little kid seeing this on TV, it's very dark. It's filmed very dark. And the way that it's lit, these things looked absolutely terrifying to me. They were wet. and shiny looking, and they're small, and it was like, you know, filmed sort of in like swamp and woods and stuff like that, and they were just, they scared me so much. Like these, just seeing these creatures, I was just like aghast. And then I was afraid that I was going to run into them or see them somewhere. And there's also a particularly grisly scene where they go, you know, it's Hicksville, so they end up on a farm and they go messing with some cows, and a bull gores one of them in the eye, and it's pretty graphically portrayed. And that like just burned an image into my head as a child. And for a very long time, I was really worried about like little disgusting shiny creatures, you know, moving with kind of a group mentality, you know, that couldn't be killed, that were, you know, were something that I would like come around a corner and see, you know, while I was outside walking at night or something like that. So totally dumb film. Like it's ridiculous now to think of being scared of it, but I do remember, and I still kind of feel some of the initial terror that I had when I first saw those creatures. And I was like, and they were like nothing I'd ever seen before as well. So as a little kid, it was like shocking. So
Yeah.
very
Anti-munchkins looking at coming for you.
exactly. I mean, eventually they were killed, and the thing that killed them was light. So
Sure.
it's very silly.
Isn't 57 is also the year that Sputnik went up. So that's a good, that makes sense for flying saucer kind of horror. Because they were all
Yeah.
scared in 57, right?
Oh,
Everyone.
sure. Yeah, I think a lot of it too, I didn't expect it. I didn't expect that on TV. I didn't expect to see anything that I saw. And also it was out of context. I hadn't been watching the rest of the film. It was just like suddenly there were these terrifying things on there, and I was just like, ah,
Yeah.
and you know, nightmares and bad dreams and stuff like that.
I think it's another thing they used to use in movies like that. I mean, you had your Saucermen with their big eyes. And I can think of a couple of other 50s kind of horror science fiction movies that had a similar setup, and they couldn't do big special effects, but they could put in gore, like the eyeball thing. And I can think of another film, I think it's Fiend Without a Face, perhaps, where Lee Van Cleef in an early role shoves a blowtorch into another alien's eye and melts it.
Ooh.
And
wow. Eye stuff. Yeah.
Giant alien eyes. And
Yeah.
again, we can do gore even if we can't do anything flashy.
I think there was something regulations around that. If you were doing violence to another human, it counted as one rating. But if you were doing violence to something else, creature made up make believe kind of thing, it didn't count in the same way. I could be completely wrong on this, and I'm sure people in comments will fix and correct me on this, but I could swear that there's a thing associated with that.
Probably
Wouldn't
true.
surprise
It
me.
makes sense. Yeah, totally.
I mean, part of remnants of the Hays Code hung around till the 70s. So
True.
I'm sure that there were I'm sure that somebody had rules like that. I remember writing for TV very early in the 80s, and one of the weird rules they told us is you can have jeopardy but not danger. And no one knew what that meant, but that was the rule.
What?
Right.
No one could define that, but yeah, jeopardy but no danger.
Are they trying to cause you pain? Or are they just actively trying to cause you pain as an employee? Of like, okay, you're a writer, you're sitting in this room, you may cause jeopardy, but no pain. It's like, hey.
Okay, so what was the monster? There was, Richard, you said there was a monster, one monster version of a monster.
Tarantula was sort of was my monster.
Okay.
But still sticking with black and white, 1963, 63's The Haunting still scares me to this day. I think it's the best made American haunted house movie above all others.
Interesting.
And I know people are going to argue with me about this, but The Haunting really really, really stays with me, and I'm going to make the Saucermen go away.
Okay. I
We're
mean, The
going to go back
Haunting
to our
is
original.
just, it's on all the lists, right? Like it's on all the filmmakers'
It really
lists
is.
of, best / scariest of all time. But it scared you as a kid.
It scared me. I saw it way too young. It's one of those movies. It's a very adult kind of horror. And I saw it, my uncle showed it to me way too young. I don't remember how young, but it was on. We had a couple of channels that showed movies without commercials in New York when I was a kid. And so we just got to watch the whole thing end to end in black and white. And wow, it just knocked me out. It's based on Shirley Jackson's book, The Haunting of Hill House.
Mhm.
And it's directed by Robert Wise, which is, I think, the other reason that it's so good, because Robert Wise, well, one of his first jobs was editing Citizen Kane for Orson Welles. So he started off with some pretty good pedigree. He also directed
Yeah.
huge musicals like West Side Story and Sound of Music, and won Academy Awards for both.
Wow.
But he also directed The Day the Earth Stood Still. So he knew his way around weird films. The setup of The Haunting is Dr. Markway, Dr. John Markway, who rents Hill House. And he has an interest in the supernatural. And what he wants to do is he's bringing people there, people with some experience of the supernatural, bring them there to document the house, and see if he can actually prove the existence of ghosts. And he brings a small group with him. Eleanor Lance, played by Julie Harris, is the star of this of the story. But we also have Theodora, played by Claire Bloom, who is a very early appearance of a queer character in a major mainstream movie. Now she's not portrayed as tragic or hopelessly deviant, and she doesn't die.
Nice.
It is, nothing's ever explicit. It's early 60s, 63. So everything is very heavily coded. But Theodora is there, and on top of everything else, she becomes Eleanor's best friend and confidant. So it was a very interesting use of a queer character in a movie like that.
Mm-hmm.
So the house is extremely haunted. It was built by a horrible man named Hugh Crane about 90 years earlier, who abused and dominated his family psychologically, religiously, physically, and left this horrible aura in the house. So Hugh Crane's spirit is definitely in there one way or another. And what's great about the supernatural aspects is it's one of those movies where everything is done with light, shadow, and sound, except for one moment. And that's the moment that I remember from my childhood that made me want to run away, and still makes my breath catch in my throat now. There's a scene in which, after a lot of scary stuff has happened, the whole group are huddled in the library together. And they're trying to figure out, well, are we going to stay in here? Are we going to go back out? And something happens, and they know there's something outside the door. And so they're all just standing there. The door handle rattles a little bit, but it doesn't open. And then the door begins to breathe, like the lungs of the house. The door pushes in for a breath, pushes back for a breath, pushes in for a breath, pushes out for a breath. And you can just feel Hugh Crane, the horrible old man, outside the door, just breathing heavily and leering at everybody inside. And it still gets to me to this day. It's one of my favorite horror moments.
It's an incredible description of that scene too. I mean, it's just because you get this sense that he is the house.
Yes, very much.
Yeah. And that he's gloating in the fact that they're in him.
Mm-hmm.
And I I was looking up that film a little bit before our show too, and I read that the director used an experimental camera for that he had to sign a waiver for because it had a warped like flaws in the lens.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, it had to have added to it. I don't specifically call anything like that, but
Well, the visuals all the way through are really spectacular, and they are very subtle. So you wouldn't notice anything like in one particular shot,
okay.
oh, this is the shot where the crazy stuff is happening. He's a much more
Right.
subtle director than that, but he knew what he was doing. Like Kubrick's, we knew like if I use this one lens at this one moment, it's going to create an effect that nothing
Right.
else can.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's the kind of scene that sticks with you as a child, right? Like forever.
Oh yeah.
And it's funny that you mentioned that, because not just that scene, but just the entire theme of The Haunting, because one of my scariest films as a child is The Legend of Hell House, which is from 1973. And I mean, absolutely hands down, like one of the scariest films I saw as a kid. And even still, it gets to me today. But and it's commonly confused with The Haunting. And so are the books, because The Legend of Hell House is based on Richard Matheson's book, Hell House, which is also confused with Shirley Jackson's book a lot. And don't even try to Google this film, because Google won't return results for this film. It only returns results for The Haunting. It's so messed up.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, but the Legend of Hell House it's very similar. It was made 10 years later, though. It was made 10 years after The Haunting, and it's the films, while on the same themes, are far and apart from each other in so many ways that it's possible to confuse them viewing. And The Legend of Hell House, again on a similar theme, is there's this house, and it's a big, giant, extravagant mansion. It's extremely haunted, and there was a team of paranormal investigators that were sent in 20 years before the film begins, and they all died or ended up in lunatic asylums or killed each other or became, just that it messed them up. They threw themselves out of windows, things like that. And they originally went there because there was an evil man who was rich and extravagant and owned the house. And he was he was sadistic. He was into BDSM. It was a sex party and torture kind of a scene. People there, who, when family members showed up, discovered that everyone in the house was dead, except for the man who owned the house, the rich guy, Belasco. And it was the Belasco house. So paranormal investigators went in there, everybody died, only one person got out. And he's in a new team of paranormal investigators that have been hired by someone who's wealthy, who I believe now has possession of the house, is hiring them to go in and find out what's going on and clear it out if there's something in there. And one of the investigators that's going into the house, kind of the lead investigator, is a man of science. And he believes a little bit in this sort of stuff, and he's very familiar with it, but he's bringing in computers and machines and things like that so that he can scientifically record it, assess it, and figure out how to get rid of it. And he brings his wife, and he brings the one man that escaped from the first situation, and that's played by Roddy McDowall. And then a psychic, like a medium, essentially, a character named Florence Tanner. And the house itself is absolutely spectacular, and it's filmed so incredibly and so beautifully from all of these incredibly like uncomfortable angles, and in ways where you're constantly looking at the background to try and take in everything that you're seeing. It's just tons of like antlers, and there's giant pieces of erotic art on all of the walls. Like every single wall has some sort of nude or erotic painting of some kind. And there are statues everywhere. So it's just, something is like always watching the camera, you know, like a statue's always watching the camera, or you're watching a scene with just the profile of a satyr statue.
Mm.
And it's, so there's this constant feeling of the house never being empty behind them. And it's really, really beautiful. And so they go in, and the premise is, you know, they're going to go in, they're going to do an assessment, and they're already squabbling, they're already fighting. Roddy McDowall's character won't drop his wards. Basically, he's like, this house tried to kill me once. I am not interested. I am just here for the check. Give me that paycheck and I'm out of here. I am not playing. And Florence Tanner, she's the young, you know, pretty medium, and she's very religious. She's, you know, got crosses, and she's like, you know, very like, you know, God gave me this gift of being able to spirit this whole thing. And she clashed with the science very early on, and he gaslights her constantly, and he belittles her. And so he puts her in this position of needing to constantly prove herself, right? And as things progress, the rift between them grows and enhances what happens. And so finally, Florence Tanner is like, I'm going to do a sitting. Let's do a sitting. You want to test me? Let's do a sitting. I'll channel someone. Come on, let's go. So they sit down, and they, you know, the candles and the whole thing, and they start basically doing a seance, and he's recording with all of his instruments and stuff like that. Roddy McDowall is just like, well, it's nothing to do with it. And she starts channeling ectoplasm out of her fingers. And this is the beginning of this film starting to like truly scare me as a child, because I grew up in an atheist household. So like I said, Exorcist, things like that, none of the religious themes or any, you know, all those depictions of good or evil, none of that stuff really scares me. But if you want to scare an atheist, make it about something that isn't any of that stuff. And this is particularly about someone taking possession of a body in a way that isn't religious, in a way that's much less able to understand, much less able to control. And as the film progresses, Florence Tanner invites this guy to possess her. And that evening, she goes up to her room, and he's in the room with her, and she's talking to him, and you're seeing manifestations. You know, you're seeing a body under the covers in her bed, and she's kind of chastising him. And I'm like, don't talk to that thing like this. And it's really, really terrifying. Later, they go and this gets worse. So this, you know, the wife of the scientist gets possessed, and then goes downstairs and strips off her clothes and comes onto Roddy McDowall, who slaps her to bring her out of her trance. And then she's ashamed and embarrassed. And it happens again later. And, you know, people are sort of like randomly getting possessed through the film, and they find a body chained in a wall. Florence Tanner decides that it's the son of evil old man Belasco, and they bury him. They do a funeral. They put him to rest. She does the whole religious thing, and she's like, you know, thank you, Lord God, and all of that stuff. They go back into the house, and then things get worse. And she's still convinced that it's the son, and she needs to save the son, and you know, that God is giving her this gift to do this sort of thing. And there's this whole, like, you know, her vulnerability was her, you know, her being gaslit, but also her religion, her willingness to just believe and not question these things. And he, you know, she eventually acquiesces to this ghost, and he basically has really sadistic sex with her, and then possesses her body. And Roddy McDowall, like, here's it going on. They all run. They're like banging on the door. She opens the door and has the most insane smile on her face that it's giving me goosebumps to think of right now. And Roddy McDowall sits with her through the night to keep an eye on her. And she gets up in the morning, and she's still got that same deranged smile on her face. And she's covered in cuts and all of this. And you're just like, oh God, this is, yeah. And she's going in and out of speaking in the ghost's voice while she's doing it. And it's these are long shots too. These aren't edited shots. This is, you're watching these absolutely incredible performances from these actors that are just playing it. And yeah, that film truly scary, truly frightening. And we find out at the end that it was just one ghost all along, making everyone think it was a bunch of different ghosts, and it was evil old man Belasco, who had, so they do a clearing. The scientist runs the machine to clear the house. They go out, they come back. Roddy McDowall drops his wards, and he's like, everything is clear. And then we find out it's not clear.
Yeah.
Belasco murders the scientist, and Roddy McDowall goes into the chapel where Florence Tanner has been killed. She's impaled by this giant crucifix. This giant Jesus falls on her and killed her. And she wrote a message in her blood as well. And in the book, I went back and read the book as a child, and it's just, it's all full of sex. Like she did not necessarily die from just the cross falling on her. Let me just put it that way. She was impaled with something else. But Roddy McDowall goes into the chapel, and the wife is crying because she's seen her husband, and he drops his wards, and he's like, come at me, man. Like, come and get me. And the force slams him, and he comes back, and the force slams him, and he comes back. And that to me was really powerful as a child, because it was the moment that he triumphed over futility, if that makes sense.
Sure. Because
there's an element when horror doesn't work for me. One of the things that doesn't work in horror is when it's all about futility, the futility of existence. Give up, it's too powerful, or everything turns out bad, in a not noir way. It's when it's about futility, to me, I'm like, that's bad horror, like that's terrible. But that's the moment that futility is kicked to the curb, and Roddy McDowall challenges it. The glass shatters. They go through a secret hole in the chapel, and they go into this lead-lined room with the perfectly preserved corpse of Belasco. And the lead-lined room was what prevented the machine from getting in there and clearing his spirit out. And Roddy McDowall stabs the corpse, rips open the pants, and you see that he actually was one of the things about him that was so scary, the Belasco guy, was that he was so tall. He was like 6'5" or something like that. And Roddy McDowall discovers that he had his own legs amputated and had longer prosthetics put on. And then that was basically his vulnerability, like his weakness, was that he wasn't tall enough. He was a little man. It kind of reminds you of like Trump wearing lifts in his shoes and stuff like that, right? It's that, beyond toxic masculinity of needing to be taller than everyone else to prove the gender thing. Anyway, so they go and they turn on the machine, they clear the house. They're like, let's hope, the spirits of our dead friends can guide his spirit. And then this cat that's been around throughout the film is sitting outside the house. And like, as they're leaving, I'm like, oh no, that's Belasco. He's gonna be fine. He's gonna be fine. So anyway, that's, I know that was a long description of that film, but it's one of the scariest ones that I've seen. And yeah, it's just beautifully shot, beautifully acted, and just really powerful. And everything about it really scared little atheist kid me,
Yeah, it sounds like it. That's great.
Yeah. And Matheson wrote the screenplay, like he adapted it himself, which I think is kind of interesting. But it turns out he had been doing that for a while anyway. He worked with Roger Corman, and he worked with Hammer Studios for a while. He adapted Fritz Leiber work, and he adapted the works of Poe into screenplays and things like that. So it was really, I mean, you could feel how tight it was done in terms of like storytelling and making everything effective. So anyway,
that sounds
still
great.
Scary.
Like, now I kind of want to watch that.
It's so good.
I've never seen it.
It's good. It's effective in the way that it's like, you never know what time it is.
Mm,
like a timestamp will come up on the bottom of the screen, and it's like the background I have right now, it always looks like it's that time, whatever
okay.
that time is. So you're just, yeah, it's effective on so many levels, but whoo, boy, did it scare me as a kid.
It sounds like a weird version of adjacent to folk horror in a way,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is interesting to me because the British in the 60s and 70s liked taking ghosts and throwing them against technology,
Mm.
because you have your computer there. But I'm also thinking of the stone tapes in which there is this haunted building. They realize it's haunted, and then they bring in all their computers to try and deal with it and see
Yeah.
if they can clear the place. And then you have Ghost Watch, which was a television broadcast. And if it's not the inspiration for Conjuring 2, that big movie, if they didn't pay Ghost Watch a lot of money, they ripped it off. So I'm not. I'm just saying there's a lot of stuff that's the same. And basically, but Ghost Watch is in fact a live television broadcast from a haunted house by a very skeptical group of people.
Mm.
It was the
And so you have,
OG Ghost Hunters. I remember this actually.
yeah,
Wow. Awesome.
and it gets that collision of ghosts, kind of folk horror elements that then leak into the technology itself. So I'm not going to say what happens in Ghost Watch, but it's very. I'd recommend both the Stone Tapes and Ghost Watch if you like
Okay.
Hell House.
Yeah. I mean, it's Legend of Hell House is also very different from Hell House LLC.
Oh yeah.
So, it's, yeah, there's a lot of versions of this for sure. But
Mm-hmm.
this one and The Haunting, I think, are definitely top of the game. It's just interesting
Yeah.
that both of those really scared us as kids.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them have that element too, that also I find as compelling as I do still kind of scary, the idea that the house is alive,
Yes, very much.
that the house is the ghost.
Mm-hmm.
I love
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
All right, what's another one that got you?
Well, Scotland mentioned vampires earlier, so I'm going to
Yes.
talk
Okay.
about The Horror of Dracula from 1958. And also you mentioned Hammer Films.
Yeah.
This is Hammer
Yeah.
Films' first big Dracula movie. Eventually Hammer remade a lot of the old Universal monster movies. They did Dracula, they did Frankenstein, they did The Mummy. The big thing about Horror of Dracula was that it wasn't Bela Lugosi, it was Christopher Lee who played Dracula.
Oh
I
God.
never found Lugosi scary, or he's supposed to be seductive too. I never found Lugosi either one of those things. I found him a complete bore. And I know it was the 1930s,
Sacrilege.
when
Oh,
I think it was 31 when they
heretic.
did Dracula. But the standards of seductiveness haven't changed that much
To be fair,
over the years.
Christopher Lee did a good job,
Super hot.
right?
Yep,
Yep.
100%. And that's the difference. Lugosi, for better or worse, played Dracula as this seductive aristocrat,
Mhm.
whereas Christopher Lee played him as an animal, played him as a
Yes.
wolf. He was
Yeah.
pure physicality.
God, he was.
And that's what scared me about him, because I'd been used to vampires that sort of snuck up on you. And it's just like, oh, I'm your friend. And then at the last minute, they bite you. Whereas Christopher really like right at you,
Mhm.
jumping over tables, throwing people around the room. They he was pure motion. And again, it's Christopher Lee. He's 6'5". He
Mhm.
fought in World War II in the Special Forces. This is a
Mhm.
guy who knows how to be physical.
Yeah.
And what's also fun about the movie, as opposed to the original version of, in fact, a lot of versions of Dracula, which begin with the book, which is Jonathan Harker goes to meet Dracula in his castle in Romania because Dracula wants to rent Carfax Abbey in the UK. So basically, the whole first act of Dracula is a real estate transaction, which is not the sexiest or scariest thing in the world. What
Pretty
Hammer
scary.
did, what made Hammer work, is that they completely threw all that out. Everything. They threw out a lot of Dracula. What they did is Jonathan Harker shows up at the very beginning of the movie to work in Dracula's castle as his librarian. So it speeds the story along right away. You're with Dracula, you're with Harker, you're in the castle, you meet the bride of Dracula very quickly.
Mhm.
You get right into the creepy stuff. And in this version of the story, Harker is not a meek, innocent real estate agent. He's actually come to Dracula's castle on purpose. He knows who Dracula is, and he's there to kill him. So in the first 15 minutes, you have everything set up. And it took, in other films, it'd take a half hour to get there or longer. So Hammer and Terence Fisher, the director, just jump right into it.
Terrence
And of
Fisher's
course,
amazing.
Harker fails. Van Helsing, one of Dracula's brides, bites him, and Dracula does not want that to happen to Harker. So Dracula drags the bride away and leaves Harker locked in his bedroom. And that's another one of those scary moments, because Dracula throws the bride around the room, and Christopher Lee, threw the stunt woman across the room. And then when it came time to dispose of her, he picks her up and carries her out of the room. Christopher Lee picked up that woman, carried her like she weighed 5 pounds.
Wow.
I mean, this was not a special effect. This was just a huge, strong man just picking someone up, dragging them away. No effort whatsoever.
Wow.
So after Harker is been bitten by the bride, Van Helsing comes looking for him, and Van Helsing is Peter Cushing. This is
Love him too.
Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee's second movie together. They did 24
cool.
movies together in all. The first movie they did together was The Curse of Frankenstein. So this is their first vampire movie together. And from this point on, the moment Van Helsing shows up, then we really start mixing together Hammer Dracula versus Bram Stoker's Dracula. And it's all in the service of moving this story along, making it physical, making it scary. And the key to the whole thing is Christopher Lee. And he scared me to death. There was no way to kill the guy. Van Helsing finally does the traditional thing where he rips open the curtains in the morning when they're fighting and manages to burn Dracula to death. But he sort of wins by a technicality, because if it wasn't daylight, there was no way Van Helsing could possibly have overcome Dracula. And in fact, he didn't really, because Dracula shows up 5 more times in other movies, all the way up to, I think 1972 was the last one. But Christopher Lee comes at you like a freight train with teeth, and he never lets up. And Peter Cushing is very good in playing Van Helsing almost as a Sherlock Holmes figure, a very, very thoughtful, studious man who's there on a mission. He could be, well, in fact, they did do a Hound of the Baskervilles together, Lee and Cushing. And this is almost a dry run for Cushing, playing a detective like that. So it's someone who grew up with, quiet, so-called seductive vampires, to see this animal, and the movie was in color as opposed to a lot of other vampire things I'd seen. Certainly all the early Lugosi, really all the old Universal Draculas that I'd seen, all the different people that played Dracula. When Christopher Lee opens his mouth and shows you his fangs, there's blood, red blood dripping there, and it has a really visceral effect on me as a kid.
Well, and that scene too, I remember he had, like, they must have, I don't know if they used contacts or what, but his eyes were red as well.
Yes,
they were
he hated that.
Extremely
Lee
bloodshot.
Lee
But
hated that when they had to give him the red eyes.
But it made him look like he was just bursting with blood, like he was engorged because he had drank so much of it or something. And that I see, I mean, I totally get why that's scary, right? Like that's terrifying. And the physicality that you talk about with him and the animalistic fury that he imparted into the role when there were no lines, when he had no lines, even made him frightening, just absolutely frightening. And yeah, he's just there's even one scene too where I can't remember, it's one of the wives he's seducing, she's still human, and he leans into her, and the way the camera angle, the camera's like right behind her, so he sort of leans into her and you see her kind of recoil a little bit, and then he puts his nose and he sniffs and rubs all around her face, and it's just for a second, but you're like, oh wow, he just it's
he's the wolf. He's the wolf.
Yeah, exactly. So did you want to take a break, Scotland?
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, why don't we pause here for a moment and give our
Okay.
brains time to gel on all of this lovely information, and allow ourselves to have some water, quick little break, and then we'll come back. Okay, and we're back with more stories. Take it away, Violet.
All right. So it's perfect, actually, Richard, that you mentioned Horror of Dracula, because I mean, as far as like classic monsters and classic films go, like I too have a vampire film that scared the crap out of me as a child, and I saw it on TV. It was Salem's Lot, 1979. And it was the I can't remember if I saw the whole miniseries or if I saw the shortened version of it, which was the miniseries edited down to the film. But it's so campy now, like when you go back and look at it. But I think everyone is going to remember the first time they saw the scene of the kid in the window.
Yeah.
And if you know, you know. So Salem's Lot is based on a Stephen King story, and essentially it's about a writer who goes back to his hometown. I'm just super shorthand version of this. Goes back to his hometown, and before you know it, everyone's saying, "Vicious me." We basically, like, a vampire has invaded, an evil vampire has invaded, and they show up to they're like antiquers or something, like they open an antique store. They're like awesome gay older vampires, I hope. I'm just making that up, but basically it's like these two male vampires show up, they open an antique store, we only see one of the antiquers, the other one arrives in a box full of dirt, essentially. But the townspeople don't really know that, and before you know it, the scary vampire, who's sort of a Nosferatu style vampire, is converting people into vampires, like, and particularly, like, it does a lot of things that were kind of taboo, I believe, and still are, where, for instance, the evil, scary monster vampire breaks into a house and kills this kid's parents, and then abducts the child and turns the child into a vampire. And then the child goes and turns another child into a vampire. And like, those are the kind of things, like, usually, you know, in TV movies and things like that, like, kids are off limits generally, right? So this was something I hadn't seen at that point. But it was just, the way that it was filmed was really not like anything I'd seen before. It sort of like lulls you in, even though it's kind of cheesy. The guy who played the main protagonist was one of the guys from Starsky and Hutch, so he's really like, you know, hairy chest, you know, white guy, good guy kind of a thing. But it has a feeling to it, like a really intense feeling to it that is inescapable in a lot of the shots, the exterior shots, the interior shots. So it's not necessarily even about the action or the activity, but it's the dread of the film. The whole thing is just, it's this dread-soaked story. And when you finally get to the point of the little boy protagonist in bed, and his friend shows up at the window, now a vampire, completely pale, and is at the glass, wakes him up and is at the glass and saying, and smiling and saying, "Let me in." And he's kind of floating around. And that scene, for all of the reasons I've described, is so scary. And it scared me so badly as a child. And that, coupled with the monster vampire having broken into a house and killing the parents, all coupled with the denouement of the story, which ends up in a house where really bad things happen. So once again, we have this theme of a house feeling possessed, right? Scared me so much as a kid that, like, I would be scared that vampire was going to come in my house at night. And I would sleep, I would turn on my electric blanket and I would bunch it up around my neck when I slept, so that if he tried to bite me, he'd get electrocuted. Like, that was, you know, child logic for vampire prevention. But it really got to me. Like, that whole thing really got to me. And now that I've like taken the time to go take a look and do some research about that series and that film, so it turns out the director was Tobe Hooper.
Yes.
It was originally supposed to be George Romero. And the trivia and the lore says that Romero didn't do it because he couldn't do it with the budget they had, which doesn't make sense to me, because it had a $4 million budget, and Carrie, which had a theatrical release, was 1.3 million at the time. So I feel like Romero maybe backed out for other reasons, but for whatever reason, Tobe Hooper ended up directing it. And it was right after he'd done the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I didn't see Texas Chainsaw Massacre until I was an adult. And when I did see it, I was like, this is a fucking masterpiece. Like, this is an absolute masterpiece of a horror film because of so many things. And it's the things that you realize aren't in the film. You never see anyone killed on screen in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's all filmed in natural light. You know, so it's the Shining was like that too, where it was like that natural light creepiness. So this explained a lot of why Tobe Hooper made Salem's Lot as emotionally and sort of like effective for your senses as it was and still is. And I also found out that parts of it were filmed in reverse. And I don't know what parts those were, but I have a feeling that some of the scenes where Danny's at the window, because when you first see him, and they didn't do wires, they didn't fly him on wires, they put him on a boom crane. So it was a much more like lowering and moving around effect. I'm wondering if parts of that was in reverse, which is why it feels so unsettling. So there were a lot of really interesting things like that in the film that just creepy crawls under your skin. And as cheesy as it is in hindsight, and as, you know, whatever, like forgettable in many ways, that film scared me. Like, I changed my sleeping habits as a child. You know, I was sleeping with one eye open for a while, for sure.
Well, isn't you mentioned your kind of, you know, beefcake Starsky and Hutch hero
Mhm.
there. But wasn't James Mason the
Yes.
vampire's hand, sort of Renfield character?
Oh, yeah, there were a lot of amazing actors in it.
Yeah,
But yeah, he was.
he would be real. I could see him. I always liked the idea of him pairing up with a vampire because he definitely has the gravitas,
Mhm.
and um, he can show contempt really well.
Yes. Yes,
And I think that was
absolutely.
really good for his character.
Yeah. So it's yeah, that was my only scary vampire film.
It's a good one. It's a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I blame Toby Hooper.
Yes. Well, I have one more movie that scared me. Still sticking with black and white. That's funny. I hadn't thought of that. I have 3 black and whites. This one's a bit of a cheat because we're talking about movies that scared us as kids. I didn't see this one until I was a teenager at a film festival, but it's Night of the Living Dead. Speaking of George Romero's
Mm.
1968 zombie film, which really gave the world zombies.
Hmm.
The zombies we now know now from a million good movies, bad movies, The Walking Dead. Um, that was Romero in Night of the Living Dead. And I probably don't have to go into real details for the kind of people that want to watch this show, but I'll do a real quick one. We open with Johnny and Barbara going to a rural cemetery to put flowers on their father's grave. Neither of them wants to be there, so they bicker along the way. When they get to the cemetery, they're attacked by a strange man, old man, who moves stiffly and as if there's something wrong with him. And he attacks Barbara. Johnny rescues her, but he falls and cracks his head and dies on a tombstone. The old man pursues Barbara through the countryside to an old deserted farmhouse where she and a collection of strangers hold up as they're besieged by an army of the dead. And that's the whole movie.
Hmm.
It's a brilliant setup for an incredibly low budget film. It's just one location, about 6 real actors, and then a whole bunch of volunteers and locals who wanted to play zombies surrounding the house. And that's it. What set it apart, I think, for films in '68, it's the first appearance of the zombies, of a creature so awful that for me, even as a teenager, gave me nightmares. The fact that these slow, shambling things that look like you could knock them over, they are mad for human flesh. And that realization in that very first movie horrified me.
Mm.
The other thing in '68 is the hero is a black man, Ben, played by Dwayne Jones. He is brave, resourceful, and the moral center of the film, a very strong character. And Romero says that he didn't cast a black man as the hero of the movie for any reason, for him being black. Whether that's true or not, the effect of Ben on the film in 1968 is really powerful, especially in terms of the ending.
Hmm.
And the ending is one of the things that truly scared the hell out of me.
Hmm.
There were 4 things that really knocked me over. The revelation that the zombies eat human flesh, and that very first scene where they do eat the young couple is really shocking. Even now, it's very quiet, not a lot of music, not a lot of stings and stuff to show you how to be scared. It's just the overall sound that I remember is the sound of zombies chewing on meat.
Mm.
The other thing that scared the hell out of me was Helen Cooper's death. Helen Cooper is part of an older couple that they find in the house. Their 12-year-old daughter, Karen, was bitten by a zombie and is in a coma in the basement. Now, this is the first
Right.
zombie movie, so we don't know the rules of of zombieism.
Right.
That if you're bitten, even if you're scratched, perhaps you're gonna turn. So
Mhm.
during the climax of the film, during the big zombie attack at the end, Helen retreats to the basement where Karen is theoretically still lying in a coma, but Karen is up now as the undead, and she stabs her mother to death with a garden trowel in a truly nasty and bloody attack, again with great sound by Romero. And what's
It's
great
so
is
effective.
it's this little girl in a flowery dress just murdering her mom mercilessly. The two other things that got to me were Barbara's death, because Barbara, while she's been very scared and almost comatose for a lot of the movie, finally comes to her senses at the end during the zombie attack and tries to hold the door against the zombies to try and save everybody. And the zombies finally overpower her. And the zombie that pulls her out of the house is her dead brother.
Mhm.
And that just horrified me.
It's emotional.
It's a very emotional moment.
Mhm.
Again, 1968, you can't trust anyone, even your family.
Yeah. And
And then
certainly
of
not the
course,
authorities.
exactly, and that leads us to the ending, which
Mhm.
is where Ben is murdered by white zombie hunters who were brought together by the local sheriff. His death is not heroic, it is quick and shocking. He is
Mhm.
simply there. He looks out the window when the zombies have gone. He survived the night in the zombie house. He hears people outside, and is the locals who are cleaning up and killing the local zombies. And he looks out the window. They see a face, and they just shoot him. And it's a group of, let's face it, a bunch of white rednecks just
Mhm.
blowing the head off a black man. And it's so quick and mindless. And it brings us to that question at the end of like, have we become the zombies in that mindlessness and thoughtless uh, attack and willing to kill? So after Ben is dead, the film itself stops and we go to a series of grainy still images of his of the locals dragging his body out with hay bale hooks, throwing him on the fire and burning him. And you have to ask if Barbara, a white woman, was the one who put her face to the window and looked out at that moment, would they have shot her the way they shot Ben? And that's, to me, that's for you to decide.
Yeah, I saw that film when I was really young. It
Mm-hmm.
was on TV, and I was um at some house full of adults that my mom had dumped me off at, and it scared me. It didn't scare me in a way that it left me with particular scenes except for one.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember sitting on someone's lap. I was very small, and I was sitting on someone's lap, and I asked her to put her hands over my eyes.
Mm.
So there was like an adult basically babysitting me, who like put her hands over my eyes. And at one
Oh.
point she leaned over and she whispered and she said, "I can feel your eyelashes." Because I was looking between her fingers.
Oh, that's
I was
great.
watching it from between her fingers.
That's great.
The scariest scene in that for me was the beginning, the opening, when they're in the graveyard.
Mm-hmm.
Because her brother's taunting her,
Yeah.
and he's going, "They're coming to get you, Barbara. They're
Yep.
coming to get you." And you're like, fucking stop it, dude. Like
Yeah.
it's upsetting the way that he's taunting her. And then while he's doing it, you can just see someone in the background a little bit. Just that
That's
little
one of the
little
things I
bit.
think worked about it. It's because it's shot so cheaply and it's all black and white and it's not the best film stock. It almost has that documentary feel to it.
It does. Yeah.
And especially in those early scenes with Barbara and her brother, it like it's just them bickering. It's not
Mhm.
like clever dialogue. It's not anything huge going on. It's just two siblings who've been at each other their whole lives. And now the brother is annoyed that they wasted a day coming to the country, and he's torturing his sister the way he probably has his whole life.
Mhm.
And it's so banal. And then the horror hits. And
Yeah.
it's just purely shocking and inexplicable in the middle of this fairly domestic scene.
Right. Well, and there's yeah, again, there's that sense of awe you were talking about, where you're just like shocked and
Yeah.
going, wow, what is this abyss I'm standing in front of now?
Mm-hmm.
You know, this world and these concepts. That I'm going to use that as my segue to talk about one more film, which had a very similar effect in a way on me that just scared me on many levels as a kid, and that was the 1978 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was on TV and just takes place in San Francisco. And, you know, I grew up in San Francisco, so it was very effective for me because I recognized all the places, you know, or most of the places that they were in for like exterior shots and things like that. But that one particularly, there were so many aspects of that really terrified me. The plot essentially is that spores or germs or something from space drift down to Earth. It's just happenstance, right? It just happens. And they take over people's bodies. And the way that they do it is they do it when people are asleep. And the films opens with essentially like people complaining about how their relatives just don't seem the same. You know, how people just seem weird and different and kind of changed. And that eventually turns into people who fall asleep next to this certain type of basically an alien plant. While they're sleeping, the alien plant makes an exact copy of them. And that exact copy of them is sort of part of this spore hive mind, essentially, that operates as one, that operates in concert. And its whole goal is to just make more. And, you know, for me, it was also like my first real body horror film, because there's the scenes, they eventually do show you what happens with the transformation while they're next to these, you know, spore plants. And it's disgusting. It's really grisly and gooey, and they're covered with like strands of like hair, like follicles or something. And there's one scene in particular where and this is the one that's got you know, Jeff Goldblum and Donald Sutherland in it. And Jeff Goldblum plays the kind of like sexy guy, and he goes to see his girlfriend or friend who works at a massage parlor as a masseuse, not a red light district massage parlor. And he falls asleep on the table, and then I can't remember exactly because it's been a while since I've seen it, but I do remember he wakes up and he has a bloody nose, and he's really out of it, and he feels something's really wrong with him. And they go into the masseuse lady is like, there shouldn't be anyone in here. Who's that? And they go into the table next to him, pull back the sheet, and it's a malformed, partially formed version of him.
Mm.
And up until this point, the two main female characters have been trying to warn the men, right? Like Donald Sutherland plays this journalist, I believe, and he's, you know, would normally the kind of protagonist where you would be like, he's going to get to the bottom of things kind of a protagonist. But the women this whole time are like, no, something's really wrong. Like, we're seeing some weird stuff. And it's this whole like prolonged period of gaslighting, and the element of essentially like spores taking over people's bodies and the way that they operated sort of in concert like a hive mind, and that eventually nowhere was safe for the few remaining people left who hadn't been basically consumed by whatever this was. It's very, there's a Last of Us vibe to it, right? You know, where it's like spores in Last of Us, spores create zombies essentially. And, you know, it's the cordyceps, a bit of the cordyceps kind of a thing where the host or the bug or the spore takes over the body, and then it becomes a zombie body, and they all think as one, they all act as one, they all feel as one. And that to me as a child was absolutely terrifying. The idea that it was like an invading sort of like a pathogen as well really frightened me. The idea that this, you know, and knowing what I knew about science and stars and cosmos and everything growing up as a kid, the randomness of it drifting over Earth like that made total sense to me. You know, I believe that, you know, that's yeah, that could happen. I could see that in a way. And by the time we get to the end, you know, and Leonard Nimoy, of course, is in it, and he plays this amazing character. He plays the exact kind of like eccentric dude from Marin that you would expect to see during those days, you know, and he's a confidant of the protagonist, Donald Sutherland, you know, and who then gets transformed as well. And we're by the time we're getting to the conclusion of the film, you know, we're seeing that they're loading these pods onto trucks. There's, you know, this one's going to Sausalito, like that sort of a thing is happening. Like they're essentially just taking over everything, right? They're colonizing the planet. And, you know, we're down to just a couple of protagonists left, and everybody kind of splinters off. And we don't know what has happened to everyone necessarily. And it's that final scene of the film that no one can forget, that is so scary and so terrifying. And it's just one moment of acting. It's not a jump scare. It's not blood. It's not anything like that. It's that one of the remaining people who hasn't been transformed has been hiding, have been essentially replaced by these pods. And it's Veronica Cartwright, and she sees Donald Sutherland out in front of San Francisco City Hall, and she breaks character from having to act like one of the emotionless, you know, spore people essentially, and is like, hey, it's me, I made it, hey, it's me. She's very like quiet, and she's like, you can tell she's kind of crazed, but she's also just like, you know, let's, you know, trying to find someone else to team up with, you know, trying to find anyone else, because she's been all alone, you know, surviving this whole thing, and was one of the earliest people to try and warn about it as well. And Donald Sutherland just turns around, and his whole face transforms in this way that's like, you would think it would be CG or prosthetics or makeup or something, but it's not. It's just what he does with his face, and it's rage, and it's disgust, and it's hatred, and he just points at her and screams, and that's it. And that was one of the scariest things I'd ever seen in my entire life, was just that moment of realizing that he had been turned, he was turning her in, but just the way, just the hatred and the vitriol with the way he outed her was just like paralyzingly scary to me.
It's one of the great endings to a horror film, I think. It's just,
yeah,
it's
absolutely
just brutal and terrifying, and it plays into what I find scary in the movie and scary in life, which is groupthink, which are mobs, groups of people who become dumber the more people that move into the group. It's like the IQs drop the more people are in a mob,
right?
And that just scares me for in the real world. And to see it, the implication this is going to be on a global scale is just endlessly terrifying to me.
It is, yeah. And that's, I mean, the Last of Us, the TV series, is is effective for that reason as well. Even though you know the conceit already,
Right.
it's still really scary. It's also really well done, but it's the way that they show the group think of the zombies is just so unsettling. Like I can still see scenes from that in my head now when I think about them, like very vividly. Like there's a scene where the zombies they're basically sleeping in the shadow of a building, and the sun is coming up, and the sun starts to touch a couple of them, and they all roll over. It's like that sort of thing. It's like, oh yeah, they are connected. So yeah, and that's, you know, there's a piece of trivia. Oh, and I have his name. It is Kevin McCarthy in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. In the original, at the end, he's running around warning people, going, you know, trying to stop them in their cars and things like that. And there's a scene in the 78 remake where the same actor is doing the same thing at one point in San Francisco. And one of the fun pieces of trivia I read was that apparently they were doing a couple takes of it on the streets of SF, and a naked homeless guy came up, recognized him from the first film, and told everyone the first one was better.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Like, that is the most San Francisco thing.
That is ever. The most San Francisco.
So
Everyone's
this is like
a critic.
So this is like a helpful Kevin McCarthy, not like the Kevin McCarthy of these days.
Oh God, no.
Right.
but a very normal naked man in San Francisco. So
that's brilliant.
Makes me so happy.
So Scotland, had you seen any of these films that we talked about?
I have seen some of them. I mean, like Dracula for sure. I mean, like I am kind of obsessed with vampires, but that's no surprise to anyone. Yeah, I think for me, like, so my mom loves horror movies, and so that was like on nonstop growing up. Just anything horror related, anything monster related, it was on. So I always caught a lot of these via proxy, but I don't know. It just always kind of sent me in the wrong direction. But I have a couple that stand out for me. The one that kind of freaked me out a little bit. I was very into Egyptology when I was growing up, so I was just like reading books nonstop about all this stuff. And then I watched the movie The Pharaoh's Curse. It's a 50s movie, I think 56, 57, something like that. It's very much a early 1900s exploration team goes to Cairo. They go into a tomb, and mummy comes up, and the curse comes upon them, and they have to go, you know, kind of battle against that and deal with it. But it's like they're so meek and meager in the way they kind of approach it, that I found that really, really interesting. And I think the bit that I'm trying to remember this too, like that as a kid that freaked me out, there's one scene where they're in a tent, and this is before they kind of like some horrible stuff happened. And I'm not describing this very well. One of the main protagonists fell into one of the tombs, and their like arm was ripped off or something. It was like, it's very strange. But later they're in their camp, and they see this shadow, and it's like this cat-shaped shadow right before like the mummy bursts in and gets them, and it freaked me the heck out to like no end. I was like jumping at shadows for weeks, just like it was so strange. Like we had our cat at the time, I'd see the shadow of the cat, and I'd be like, oh no, it's over. Like this is little 9-year-old me just being like, no, this is over. It's a really fun film. I highly recommend it. It's super dorky and kind of plays into that wonderful period of really estranged Egyptology kind of exploration films. But I think the one that really got me, that one that really kind of gave me a lot of horror like vibes and a lot of just really unsettling, as Andromeda Strain, like the original one from 1969 or something. Mainly because it's basically centered around the outskirts of Las Vegas, where I grew up. So I was kind of horrified from the perspective of that's where I lived, because everywhere they were in the
Mhm.
desert
Mhm.
seems so familiar to me. And so they have
Oh,
all these
yeah.
like wrecked buildings and they're on roads. I mean, they filmed it not far from where we lived. I'm not even sure if my dad worked on it or not, because he was working on films at the time in that area. Like it was a strange film from the sense of like this strange virus kind of like attaches itself to a ship, one of the Apollo capsules or something that crashes back
Mhm.
down and mutated to not only turn the person's blood into powder. Like that was
Right.
the first scene that was like really creepy, was like they to check the person, they cut open the wrists and all this red powder starts pouring out of it. And I was just like mortified by that. I was just
Mhm.
like, oh, okay. Well, I'm not okay with this. But it was the fact that it not only got people, that it just started eating the machinery around them,
Mhm.
and they're trying to deal with it in this bunker that has a nuclear detonation sense to it, as a safety precaution. And it was just all this like play on time. There's so much play on time. They're battling against the time of how much they had in that location versus the nuclear kind of like uh, protocol cleanup thing that was on a timer, and how much oxygen they had. Like it was always this time factor. And so it was just like genuinely terrifying the whole
Yeah.
damn time. Like just
Mhm.
sitting there going like, "Oh my gosh, can this stop?" And I'm was probably way too young to be consuming whatever themes were happening on that. And from then on out, like when I would go out and play, because there weren't many places to play in the desert, you'd be in the sand and be like, "Oh, well, I'm really freaked out by this now. Like, is there a bunker over here? Is this going to happen?" And like, this was not long before the original Gulf War stuff was happening. So there's military stuff going on
Mm.
nonstop. So it was just like genuinely traumatizing.
Mhm.
Unlike a real world, you live in it. There's other things happening in the real world, and then this, and I was confused in the sense like, is this real? I wasn't young enough
Mhm.
to
Right.
discern kind of the difference between the two of them. And so that one was like my genuine, like, just really messed me up for a long time. Um, in terms of movie. Now watching it, it's kind of charming in the sense that I'm like, oh, okay. I was really terrified of this. Okay, well, that's interesting. But in my world, um, I tended to kind of attach myself to the really corny, happy, silly things. Like I watched the Munsters religiously. I watched the Addams Family religiously.
Right.
Um, when I would watch scary movies, like there were ones like Gremlins, I loved to pieces, like because it was just dorky
Mhm.
and it just made me so happy. And it wasn't scary to me. It was kind of like, oh, okay, this is kind of fun. And the same thing with like you get into Ghostbusters and stuff like that. I didn't find it scary. I found it kind of charming.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I don't know. I just kind of attached myself to it. And then when I eventually watched Beetlejuice, I was like, no, I'm here. This is where I live now. I'm just a spooky child. I tend to like movies that are kind of that have some sense of humor to it when it comes to
Mhm.
horror. Um, or scary stuff or anything like that. Just because I don't know, I feel like it's the only way I can process any of that information. So it's a bit of an
Makes
interesting
sense.
different take. I don't seek to scare myself because I feel
Mhm.
like every day is scary enough.
Yeah.
So I always kind of like find joy in the kind of like the monsters that exist within these films, and that's kind of what I was pointing at like earlier on in our conversation. Like those monsters are friends to me more emotionally too, in the
Mhm.
sense of like, oh no no no, I fit in with that category. Like yes, this makes sense to me. I identify with said monsters in this situation. Like makes sense. It works. I'm
Mhm.
happy here. But
Well, Richard
yeah,
and I seek to scare ourselves.
Yes.
I'm here to support you in that. I'm here to support you
Okay.
Right.
and live vicariously through you in this. And I will always be this lovely little antitheel that's just gonna be like, but what about the spooky, scary little monster? That's awesome. Can I can we talk about them? Like,
Well, I'm
Well,
curious if
we're
you've ever
oh,
seen the original Boris Karloff mummy, if you liked Egyptology.
I have, and I loved it. I thought it was great.
I think
But
it's a great movie because it's a monster romance.
it's so good. It's so
Yeah,
sweet.
he's just
Like,
looking for his resurrected girlfriend from 3,000 years ago.
right? Like, how can you hate on that? How can you hate
Yeah.
on that? Or like the ever classic Plan 9 from Outer Space. Love it to
Mhm.
Oh
pieces.
yeah.
Love it to
Yes.
pieces. Like, it's phenomenal. I just have an affinity towards the like 50s and 60s kind of like horror films. I just don't think they're great. And
Hmm.
I've been challenging myself, thanks to you two, to kind of like try and watch some more of these that I always said, nah, I'm not gonna watch that one. And I
Right.
cannot remember the name of this one I watched recently, but it's a Spanish film or a Portuguese film about um a priest who fights the evils of hell and like goes and like battles against. I will find it for next time. It's
Okay.
phenomenal. It's like 1950s or no, sorry, 1967 or something like that. It's
Wow.
Hmm.
Okay.
awesome.
Okay.
Awesome.
Well,
That sounds great.
Scotland, you are really going to like some of our upcoming episodes
I'm into it.
because we have a ton of episodes planned. Um, our next episode is going to be sort of a bookend to this episode. It's going to be films that scare the shit out of us now as adults. But also, specifically with you in mind, we have an episode coming up that is films to watch with your friends and loved ones who don't necessarily like horror. Yeah.
I'm
So,
into it.
yeah. So we're looking forward to that show and a bunch of other shows. And we're
Yes.
also looking forward to some horror stuff that's coming up as well. And I want to
Right.
first ask Richard, what kind of things are you looking forward to in terms of horror? Because I know there's some cool stuff coming out pretty soon.
Well, David Slade, the director, is a friend of mine, and he has a new movie out called Dark Harvest, which is a bit of folk horror, American folk horror. So I'm really looking forward to that. If you don't know David Slade, he's most known for, I think, the vampire classic 30 Days of Night.
Oh, I love that one.
Yeah, so his new
Oh,
movie that just came out is Dark Harvest. I have not seen that yet.
I'm
Uh,
excited.
I think you've already seen the other movie I'm looking forward to. Damien Runa, Runya, perhaps is his last name, the director and writer of Terrified, has a new movie out, When Evil Lurks. Have you
Oh
seen
my
you've seen
God.
that one, haven't you?
I just saw it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And whoa, just a big whoa. It's a good thing you like French Extreme. Let me put it that way.
All right.
It is not for all audiences. Like, whoa.
Oh,
So
well,
what
I'm
you're
really looking
saying is
forward
that
to
shouldn't be my first movie.
You should never see that film, Scotland.
it.
Ever. Like, never, ever, ever, ever. It
Yeah.
is, it's a lot.
Okay.
It's just a lot.
Oh, I'm
I
looking
know we
forward to
said
that.
I know we said we do spoilers on the show, but we don't try to do spoilers with each other. So I'm gonna not spoil it, but I am gonna say that you definitely want to like buckle in for that one.
Great.
And yeah, have some anti-anxiety medication nearby and
Yeah.
also some
Excellent.
things to keep you from barfing. Um,
Yeah, Scotland. We're gonna be talking about a lot of French films along the way, and you just don't see any French films we mentioned. Just
yeah,
none of them.
we
Don't
have
forget the French.
we have an episode about extreme horror, French extreme coming up, and that's definitely you're gonna be like, those are the films you write down, some you make sure you never see.
But but this is great for me because like I love the exposure and I love kind of I like the challenge to myself to kind of like consume some of this because I do see the benefit of like kind of getting that vibe and feeling it out and exercising it a little bit. So I'm taking it on as a little bit of a challenge, but I will make a note to not watch those first.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there
Yeah.
anything else you're looking forward to, Richard?
I think you might have beaten me to this one too. Appendage.
Yes, that is great.
Yeah.
It surprised the hell out of me. You definitely think it's going to be this one type of horror film and it just goes in a different direction.
Oh,
So
that's great.
yeah, I think you're really going to dig that one. for sure.
Cool. How about you? What are
So
you looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to something that I think Scotland might like, actually. Peter Dinklage is the Toxic Avenger, the new Toxic
Right.
Avenger.
Oh, hell yeah.
Uh-huh. And
Oh, hell
it's not
yeah.
out yet. It just debuted at the end of September, I think at an Austin Film Fest. But it's on the way. It's on the way, and I'm just gonna eat that with a spoon. Like, that is gonna be so much fun for
Trauma
sure.
for life. Like
Yeah,
100% trauma for life.
totally. And I'm also looking forward to Jordan Peele has a new book that he edited
Yes.
called Out There Screaming, and it's a collection of Black horror. And I have heard nothing but good things about it.
Me
Like,
too.
everyone I've talked to that's read it or even read parts of it are like, this is amazing. And it has N.K. Jemisin in it,
Hmm.
but I just will read anything they write anyway. So I already know I'm in. But yeah, so that is
Yeah.
something I'm really looking forward to, like, big time. I'm also looking forward to, did you see the 2022 film Barbarian?
Yes. Very good
Okay,
movie.
excellent film, right? Totally
Yes.
surprising. And just what a wild ride that one is. That's basically the premise is woman rents an Airbnb because she's doing a job interview. Someone else rented the same Airbnb at the same time as her. It's Bill Skarsgård. He's like really hot. But she's really kind of creeped out. And then she finally warms up to him a little bit. Fast forward, fast forward, fast forward. There's a monster in the tunnels under the Airbnb, and they capture women and keep them captive. And it's just like, there's a big scary mother monster figure, and the whole thing, it gets really dark. And they are going to make a video game out of it. It's going to be a first person shooter
That's
video game.
insane.
Yeah,
That's
so that,
insane.
I was like, when I read that, I was like, ooh, I want to play that one. I'm not a big survival horror fan in terms of
Yeah.
gaming, because survival horror does stuff that I don't like, in terms of they make the player be very ineffective. Like, they
Hmm.
make it all about running and hiding and being scared, whereas I like to fight the evil. Like, some survival horror will be like, here's you're trapped in the haunted school, but the only thing you can defend yourself with is hiding and pencils. And then you
Right.
can't find any pencils. There are no pencils anywhere. And then you get one pencil and they break. And then later in the game, they give you the ability to make pencils, but you can only carry one pencil at a time. And you're just like, stop crippling
What
the
about
main,
chair? Like
right? So
stapler.
I know. So I'm hoping that with Barbarian, they'll make it so that, like, the first person shooter can actually do some shooting and killing of monsters. But that's
Oh,
going to be
that's
really
great.
cool.
That
And
sounds
then
terrific.
one more thing I'm looking forward to is this little book, you might have heard of it, called The Dead Take the A Train. It's by these two writers. I really
This
dun
book.
dun.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Which looks amazing, by the way.
Two of my favorite horror writers.
Yeah, it's a
Absolutely
great cover. We got really lucky with this. I wrote this with Cassandra Caw, and
gorgeous.
it is a gory cosmic horror rom-com with a huge body count.
Yes. Just
And
that's all my catnip in one spot.
yes. So with a queer romance in the middle of it. So
Perfection.
that's
Sign me up.
Yep. Yeah, I wanna get the audiobook, actually, of that
the
one.
audiobook is really great. The
Oh, cool.
narrator is just tremendous.
Oh, I love
I'm
it.
really
I
happy
love
with
it.
that a lot. We both are.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Who's
I'm also
I was gonna say, who's narrating it?
Of course, I
Oh, sorry.
completely drawing a blank. I'm sitting here running through names in my head, and I should have written it down, and I apologize to the narrator for not remembering their name.
It
But
happens.
I'll mention it on the next episode.
We'll put it in the notes for this show too,
Yes, we can do that.
for sure. For sure. But yeah, Cassandra Caw, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Okay. Big fan. Big fan. Like, I think I've read everything they've written. I think it was Nothing But Black and Teeth.
Yes, that was a right. That was a really big one. I think that sort of opened them up to a wider audience, so that their newer book that just came out, The Salt Grows Heavy, which is a retelling of The Little Mermaid in a very beautiful, gory way, is
Awesome.
really, really kind of a big hit, I think.
Oh my
So
I'm-
it's a tremendous book, and it's
Okay,
a
there's another
novella,
thing.
so it doesn't take you a million years to read.
That's okay. I could read anything they wrote at any length. I mean, nothing but
Yeah.
Black and Teeth inspired me as a writer. Like it scared me and thrilled me, and I had to go back and read it again. But also as
Mhm.
a writer, I found myself returning to passages to just kind of go, wow, how did they shape that scene? Like that's amazing. So
Yeah, and they have amazing prose.
yeah, so we a lot of good stuff to look forward to,
Yeah,
including more episodes of the show.
more episodes of the show. And to be more self-serving, I have 2 more books out this year.
Yes.
My first story collection, The Secrets of Insects, is out from Subterranean Press.
Is that
And
horror? It must be horror.
that is
too.
horror. That's a lot of
Yeah.
horror and dark fantasy.
Awesome.
And I have one more book. I'm sorry to put all this on, which I promise I won't keep doing this. I'm just going to do
You
this
better
on this
keep doing
show.
this. I love it.
The Pale House Devil
Oh, that
is the first part of a new trilogy. 2 hitmen, one alive and one is dead, who are used to killing things, meet a cosmic horror that is not alive or dead, and they have to figure out how to deal with it.
I love this.
That's rad.
Yeah. That's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I hope so. I think so. There's one other really nice story I want to mention. That's Wild Spaces by C.S. Coney. And that's if you like your families messed up, it's a really good one. And again, with a really big dose of horror. But what made me more uncomfortable than the horror aspect was this disintegrating family. And one member of the family really is toxic, and it brings the whole family down. And reading it, I kept thinking, that's one of my uncles. And so that really got under my skin.
Awesome.
So I really recommend that one too, Wild Spaces.
Thank you.
And the Scotland was kind enough to pull up the name of the narrator for The Dead Take the A Train, Natalie Naudus, who does an amazing range of voices, because there's a lot of characters in that book, and manages to make each one distinct and really fun.
I love that. All right. Well, I think we're good for this show.
Yeah, I think
all of our childhood trauma, horror trauma together.
I'm sure there's plenty more, but we have to actually charge people for the therapy build hours that they would need to process through all of those. So we'll spare people that unfortunate amount.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to Raised by Horror. You can find out more about us at raisedbyhorror.com, where we've got a little blog going. And we also have a Ko-Fi if you want to support this crazy haunted hayride. And we also have a YouTube channel. So come on by, recommend us, say hi, and welcome along.
Do it now. Subscribe.
Do it.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Finito.
Sweet.
Right.